Okay, we'll probably start, and the rest will have to catch up. So, us versus them, a biological imperative. Are we programmed for it rather from a biological standpoint rather from just a social standpoint?
And I'd like to, just to cause trouble, offer an opposing view or an alternate view. Certainly, it is true once you get down to brain chemicals that are encouraging particular behavior, then that's a sign of real long-term evolutionary pressure to get to where a kind of behavior influences the brain that further influences your behavior. Uh, there were a lot of articles that we saw that talked about the brain chemicals that influence the views of tribalism and division, but there also are a whole series of things that are supporting social identity, flexibility, and inclusion. Behaviorally, you have them like exogamy, the fact that you need to find partners from another group than your own. You also see them in these trading networks that span literally thousands of miles. And there are brain chemicals also involved in that stuff, oxytocin and the endorphins, dopamine and serotonin. And so also the brain has evolved for us to be altruistic and inclusive. So it's not as simple as one side or another. It's a matter of which is appropriate now and how do you have a society and a life that balances these two sides. So just trying to cause trouble.
Now you are causing trouble.
Uh,
Go ahead, Paul.
am I coming into the middle of a conversation? I don't know what position Richard is speaking in contradistinction to.
Well, the contradistinction, I think, is that biologically we are hardwired to have this us versus them approach. And
Well,
what he's saying is that the man has the capability to override that.
yes, well, all innate means, at least in my usage, is that you have capabilities that can be accentuated or not. It doesn't, they're kind of lying around to be used. And so he's absolutely right that cooperation is important to any animals that are dependent on living in groups. Um, so it just depends in circumstances whether you're, um, how strongly your us and them, shows itself. Um,
Versus S&S. And
Right.
my point also is that since both of them involve the connection between brain chemicals and behavior, then both of these things have to be long-standing in the human species to get it to evolve all this internal mechanism.
Sure.
Yes,
Go
Joy.
ahead, Joyce.
And it's not just the human species that those brain chemicals impact feelings of being part of the group. I've read research where they've studied, for instance, dogs who have the same brain chemicals humans do around members of their group, which is
Yes.
probably part of why we feel that our dogs, love us and want to be with us. So I agree with you that those brain chemicals are long-standing in humans and lots of other mammals, I think, and help to create our feeling of, being part of a group versus the us and them. But I do think they're long-term.
I read recently new research that shows that mice give other injured mice first aid, which is kind of altruistic behavior, taking care of your buddy.
Well, there's a lot of studies done on primates on various degrees of both cooperation and alpha male type of
Mhm.
fighter that are both contradictory to either or any way you want to look at things.
Now, where we were in India, there were these langur monkeys, which are very beautiful, impressive animals, especially as they leap through trees. And the langur monkeys have one main group that is run by an alpha male, and then all the females they are kind of the wives of the alpha, and the young ones, the young males, when they get older, go off and live in another group of male monkeys who work it up until they can uh, try to conquer the alpha monkey. And when the fight for the alpha monkey is going on, it turns out that the other monkeys are having such fun that they change the kind of evolutionary uh, background of their tribe. So the alpha monkey may sound tough, but the other monkeys are having fun.
Bob, my understanding of this sort of interplay is that it's not an either or, but it's kind of a both and, in the sense that there are these things working in our brains for inclusion, cooperation, etc. And that's sort of the basis of how we do deal with the us them dynamic. And kind of one of the things that's going on in our brains is this an us or is this a them? We kind of like it to be an us because then we can enter into a cooperative relationship. But then if something happens that, is a little bit, whatever, competitive or conflicting, then it can flip into a them. And I guess this oxytocin chemical can function either way. My understanding from the reading is that the cooperation aspect of oxytocin is actually a little bit stronger than the competitive, but that it can flip in the other direction depending on how we perceive, the other entity. So that's kind of how I read it anyway.
A lot of the us and them in human society is driven by this tribalism. And when we're a part of a tribe, we identify with the people and goals of that tribe, and we set that tribe out against the neighboring tribe. And I think this tribalistic tendency is one of the things that has leaked into American politics in a big way.
Well, it's all over the world, actually. But the question is, how do you expand? Do we have the capability to expand that circle so that we are more us than them?
Well, this is a
Big question. Yes, Paul.
this is this is an interesting argument that Steven Pinker makes, that over the course of history, war has had a lot of beneficial effects because it's welded us into ever larger groups who belong to the us. And so there's a certain us that US citizens share that stands out like a sore thumb in any other country in the world. And somehow it's partly through a lot of struggle, including this American Civil War, that the us is so big. So even though we're divided politically, I'm not really sure it's how it compares to the political divisions during the Vietnam War, but we've certainly been through something like this before. So I guess in terms of what expands the us, it isn't just the sort of rationalism that the Enlightenment talked about. Sometimes it's brute force, if you will, what forces people to be in the us together.
Well, I read somewhere, when you meet someone, what you want to do is find what is in common between the two of you. Do you like the same football team? Do you like long walks on a sandy beach? Whatever it is, because that's what will make them part of us.
Us.
Yeah, because if you found enough common things, they'll say, oh, wow, you're one of us.
That's right. You do that when you're at a party, right? With these
Absolutely.
strangers.
Anytime you're meeting somebody, you want to find out what's in common to know whether they're going to be with you or of another group, the others.
Well, the problem there is that you sometimes make flash judgments based on false assumptions.
Sure.
Mark, that makes me think of the talk that you gave us, that is the assumptions that we make when we meet somebody.
Right. Yeah. You know what, guys? Realizing just now I can't stay. So regrets, and I'm gonna have to say goodbye. I've got something up here I have to pay attention to now. Okay.
Adios.
Thanks, guys.
Yep, bye, Mike.
Bye.
You know, you said something about wars bringing us into larger groups, going from city states to nation states. But at the same time, I think we've had a countervailing influence in that, like in the United States, we can see this quite a bit, where the very large country, and we're now breaking into smaller groups. So for instance, you know, there's the association by state. So if somebody asked me where, I might say I'm from California, not the United States. There's also the association by political viewpoint or societal viewpoint that what we're seeing in politics. So I think that we've been brought into larger groups, but I don't know if people are uncomfortable in those larger groups and have to find a way to make their groups smaller. I don't know but it does seem to be that is the case.
And then actually,
Comments on that?
Yeah, I think we could be going into smaller groups, and because nowadays we have what we're talking over right now and ways of communicating across, from ocean to ocean, they can get pretty divisive and vocal and promote their us against them narratives to make it stronger and deeper and more hard to get over later.
But the same tools you can use the way we're using it to expand our us. It's complicated.
So what comes to my mind? What comes to my mind are the huge rallies that Bernie and AOC are doing. There's a Substack I read, Jess Piper. She's a rural Democrat, and she's going all over the Midwest. And she said usually they expect 30 to 40 people, and she's getting 150. So I'm not sure how that connects, but it's like the us of the pissed off people is getting bigger.
Mike, you're going to make a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, obviously ideology is a big part of it. One of the things I like about the UU fellowship is that it's by design, it's by declaration, very inclusive. You can be an atheist, you can be quite religious, and certain ways. There are other groups that are, if you're not, I mean, there's standard cults. If you don't actually belong to the membership of the cult, you're out. So you can have ideologies that can be more inclusive or less inclusive. The other thing I think about is how the political divisions have become so much sharper in the last, several decades. If you go back to the election of Dwight Eisenhower versus Adlai Stevenson, and you look at the respective positions of Eisenhower versus Stevenson, you can hardly find a hair's breadth between them. I mean, there's some respects that even Stevenson was more conservative in his viewpoint about the military. We know the famous Eisenhower military industrial complex, statements, coming from obviously a 5-star general. So I think how we even define our groups has a big part of how we sort of define the we or us. And I really believe that one of the things we should always work towards is trying in our groups to be as inclusive as possible. I don't think that solves everything. I don't think every ideology can accept everything, but I think the more that you can accept and celebrate, the better.
It seems to me that there's a very sharp division. One is on the us versus them, is that you look for the differences. And one for the inclusion and the humanity, you look for the similarities. And I think the instinct is to look for the differences rather than the similarities. And I think that's what we're hardwired on. It's also, I think, related to the fight versus flight syndrome, the threat, and how that translates into a social dynamic now. That very basic hardwired. Comments?
I'm sorry, I missed one word in your sentence. What was it that united those people? They were oppressed?
Similarities versus differences.
Yes.
In other words, when we're looking for inclusion, we're looking for the similarities amongst us. When we're looking for exclusion, we're looking for the differences between us. And right now, I think that we are on this thing of emphasizing differences, emphasizing the xenophobia, rather than the inclusion of humanity and what it is to be humankind.
If you look at that in terms of brain chemicals, it's almost the difference between cortisol, the stress hormone, the fight or flight hormone, versus oxytocin, the love hormone.
But they did say in the readings that oxytocin, and I don't really understand the chemistry of it or whatever, but it could also turn the other way, depending on how you thought
Right.
or us or them. But one of the examples that I thought of is it was a number of years ago, I was reading a book about the first indentured servants that were coming to what became the United States. And the first groups of the indentured servants, especially after 1619, you could have black indentured servants or white indentured servants. And the status of both was about the same. And what began to happen is, if I remember the reading well, is that as the conditions for these indentured servants became a little bit more distressed or worse than they expected, that the black indentured servants and the white indentured servants started forming their own affiliation. Hey, we're kind of getting beat up here and we don't like it. And they started complaining and started, making their views known that they didn't think this was a great idea. And that what some of the owners did to kind of divide and conquer almost is they started giving greater privileges to the white indentured servants. They started favoring the white indentured servants with the thought that, hey, we can't let these people affiliate, and because then they're going to be bigger than us. So we have to sort of divide this, and the way we're going to do this is we're going to give more privileges to the white indentured servants, kind of bring them on our side, and then we'll have the power base. So, that to me was an example of where, you can have two groups that we would think of today that might not be affiliated, but were very willing to be affiliated until the other group came in and gave them a reason to divide against themselves.
So they're the slave owners or the indentured owners were using the us versus them as a way to control both groups.
Right, exactly.
Divide and
That sounds
conquer.
familiar.
Divide and conquer. Okay, I was gonna say something and I lost my track.
Uh-oh, it's
Oh my.
Yeah,
I'm sure it was very profound.
I don't know about that. Oh. The thing about this we, them, and the xenophobia, the question really begs itself is, how do we get out of the cycle? And what can we do to get out
Right.
of the cycle that we're in?
What was the word, Bob? How do we get out of what?
The cycle,
Cycle. Thanks.
yeah, that we're in. Susie, did you have a thought? No? Okay.
Mute. I just in case.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh. Oh my God, last time.
Well, since nobody else is saying anything, the AOC and Bernie coming together, that's it's got two sides to it. One could get, let's just call them the Democrats, more saying, oh, you guys are so bad and like we got all the answers. Or if it would be possible to bring some on the other side, some of the Republicans in to see it, that could be some way to soften those differences for them to have realizations of, whoa, they're not talking about this stuff on Fox News or what they get on Telegram or wherever.
Well, a classic example of this coming together against a common threat is all of a sudden the politics of Canada.
That's right. They have found a way to unite themselves against a common enemy.
Something similar will likely happen in the US if the administration continues to what they seem to be doing to try to reduce Social Security and Medicare. That will bring a lot of people in the US together, as in we are all trying to fight for our Social Security.
Good point, but only if they continue to focus on those at the top and not the little guys who may have voters' remorse in the middle and bottom. They are, but they were
this us versus them shows up in this voter remorse, as I have been continuing to read about what's on the mind of the Trumpies. Most of them are still committed to Trump for reasons that I can't understand, but they seem to be pretty unshakable, that somehow they're so rooted in this, we could call it tribal identity, that mere facts don't get through.
We haven't really explored the concept of irrational, like a cult, belonging to a cult, irrationality of ignoring any sort of reason or fact, but just going on feeling. We belong. They do not. They're bad. We're good. And this either from a micro to a macrocosm. This has been the case over the years, over the centuries, and through history.
And in this case,
It would-
the
Go
ahead,
Trumpies are
Deborah.
also speaking of feeling excluded.
Deborah, you were going to say something.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know, out of all the thousands of people that are flocking to these rallies, how many are actually Republicans who have seen the light? And I don't know that there's any way to, unless you had somebody standing at the gate checking, but I would be willing to bet it's not all just independents and Democrats that are showing
I
up.
would
So-
bet you're right.
There-
I
there's
think
al-
one of the things that you were talking about, Bob, with the cult, I think that what we've seen is that definitely the emotional pull of belonging to a group or the cult is a lot stronger than our intellectual, understanding of facts. I mean, so it almost seems that whatever we do to counter the cult has to be emotional in some way as well.
I think you're right, Joyce. Certainly, I think the last election pointed out how not persuasive mere fact can be.
There's also that dynamic of becoming what I've heard is called pot committed. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's that
Can you
notion
repeat that, Mike? I didn't quite catch it.
that notion of becoming pot committed. I don't know if you've heard of that before. I kind of
No.
heard that recently, and sort of the psychology about that. The reason they call it pot committed is they're using, gamblers who are playing, poker. And if they put money into the pot, one of the things that distinguishes a professional poker player from an amateur is professionals have trained themselves to not become emotionally committed to the money they put in the pot. In other words, they put the bet in, they get the next card, the card says, you're out.
Mhm.
They fold and they say, I lost that money, but don't get involved. Whereas an amateur will say, even though it's a bad card, but I've already put in this money and I can't lose this money. And so they'll continue to make a bad bet. And sort of the dynamic of what that is sort of like psychologically, when you've invested in something like a Trump or whatever, and even as it starts to turn bad, there's that feeling, I don't want to feel like I've made this terrible mistake. Now, at a certain point, when you get enough cognitive dissonance, when it kind of goes over the top, then you can, but there's always this sort of battle going between you. I remember I had a friend, this was during the Nixon impeachment, or the whole thing, and big Nixon supporter. And it wasn't until the very end that he was able to let go of Nixon because, he was a crook. But it's a hard thing to do. And I think that's one of the things you kind of have to build into the equation is how people can get committed to something, even as it turns bad, and they're reluctant to let it go.
Right. I think you're onto something, Mike.
Another example, and we haven't really talked about this, but another example of being committed is in religion. Mine is good, yours is bad. It's always that dichotomy.
Mhm. Or if not bad, at least they're not going to my heaven.
That's
Special.
So, where does that leave us? How do we overcome our base instincts?
Open-mindedness, love, inclusive,
Awareness,
training you.
awareness that
What do you mean by awareness?
realizing that there is the propensity to separate people into camps and trying to work. I don't have a solution, but I'll give you an example. So my former neighbors, who were really nice people, he had a MAGA hat hanging outside his house. And I worked really hard to not let that interfere with our relationship. I don't know if that was right or wrong, but one of my neighbors will no longer talk to any of the Republicans that live in our complex. She just will have nothing to do with them. So I don't know where that leads, but
Mhm.
that's my thoughts. So
Well,
that
I read,
awareness that we, you know, they go low, we go high, that we can be better at not letting us not getting sucked into the us them as much. I don't know. I'm babbling.
well, I read that what you want to do is discuss, not debate. So when you're with your MAGA neighbor, discussing might eventually have a benefit to where they come closer to your side. Whereas a debate, somebody wins, somebody loses. So just open discussion may be the way to deal with your MAGA neighbor.
They move back to the States.
Okay, the next ones. You're sure to meet other MAGA supporters.
Well, let's extrapolate.
Let me, can I
out.
just, Bob, can I just say something? So we always assume if you're a Republican, you're MAGA. And I don't think that's true. I think there are Republicans who are not in that MAGA cult and are feeling very disenfranchised now and maybe looking for a place where they can belong. And so,
Well, Liz Cheney's probably the classic example of that.
who's the other one?
Kissinger.
Yeah,
Adam Kinzinger.
A few, I mean, you know, what is it, the MS, I don't remember, it's, if I think it's the MSMB, you know, Joe, what's his name, Scarborough, I think he's a Republican to this day, if I'm not mistaken. And he's very critical.
David Brooks as well on NPR. I mean, so I think there definitely are a lot of Republicans who are not MAGA.
The Lincoln Project folks are all Republicans.
So
that's an example of not assuming, not making that assumption again. If you're a Republican, you're bad, you're a MAGA, I don't want anything to do with you. Check out the assumption, as Mark told us in his presentation.
So looking at this, there is always a point of disagreement or a different view. And I think one of the ways to approach the similarities rather than the differences is to have honest discussion about the different views that we each have and why, rather than pointing saying you're wrong, I'm right. And again, it can only happen on a starting small, one-to-one basis and expanding out.
Now, one of the things that I think the current administration makes possible is a discussion about the benefits of cooperation and diversity, because we will see happening in real time all over the world what happens when you have a leadership that is against cooperation and diversity. And so that means we have the opportunity to pitch the benefits of getting along.
Comments?
So Bob, I had a related question, and that is, and I think this is, I mean, this is something I'm really struggling with, and my wife is really struggling with. You know, I was able to sort of go into sort of the conversation mode really all the way up through Mitt Romney. I didn't like his policies. George W. Bush, the same thing, you know, very much opposed to the war in Iraq. I think one of the things that just really, when they asked, I can't remember who asked him the question when he made the decision to go into Iraq, did you talk to your father about it? And he said, wrong father. And, you know, what his allusion there was, you know, he didn't need to talk to his father, who was a policy expert, but if he prayed about it, you know, that was going to be, you know, what all he needed to do. But at any rate, I think, until the Trump administration came along, I really felt like I could do that. And the question I have is when do the lines become where you can't cross? I mean, another book that I read years ago was a book, I think it was called The Society of the White Rose. And it was actually an opposition movement in Nazi Germany. It was largely of students, a core group of students. And they just said, based on what was happening, this is untenable. There's no discussing it anymore. And we are going to be, I don't know all the things they did, but they committed, some kind of, they would try to blow up installations or booby. I don't remember what it was, so don't quote me on that. But, they are remembered today. And by the way, they were eventually all captured and killed by the Nazis. But they are remembered today, of course, as heroes because they were, or probably the classic example is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had that nice cushy position, I think, at the University of Chicago Divinity School, and said, no, I have to go back because my country's in trouble. And they caught him, and Bonhoeffer was eventually executed. So I'm not trying to say that that's where we're at today, but there is a line that at a certain point, you just say the moral, the moral conditions or the moral problems or the moral issues are too difficult. I think one of the things that horrified me the most was when I heard one of the MAGA folks say of this latest deportation that there was someone who was definitely caught up and was not deserving of deportation. And I think it was Steve Bannon, I may be wrong about it, was commenting the comment was, well, if we deport a couple people who don't deserve to be deported, that's just too bad. Well, that just to me is untenable. So that's a related question to me is when is that line crossed that you really can't go back anymore?
Well, here's the thing, and I understand your feelings, Mike, and it's one I think we are all wrestling with. Where you draw the line when your core values are threatened, the beliefs that make you, not you, but make you who you are threatened and say are wrong. How do you deal with that? How do you integrate yourself into a world that allows that? And that's something I struggle with too. I think we all do. And it's a very valid question. And it really blows up the whole we versus them argument in favor of the we versus them. And it's hard to be inclusive when these people are threatening who you are in your core. And if anyone has any enlightened view or idea of how to cope with this, boy, I'm all ears.
I mean, I think there is a point beyond which you can't accept someone. I've seen some of what people have said about some of these Venezuelans who've been sent to that concentration camp in El Salvador, and that's not something I can accept. And I think we all have a line that we draw it maybe in different places, and I think we have to do that because we're moral beings. If you have no line, you're not a moral being.
Go ahead, Bob.
I had my first discussion about this kind of thing probably, I don't know, it must have been about 2010 or 2011, because I was somewhere off the coast of Central America, 2:00 in the morning on watch with a dear friend of mine, which is when the truth always comes out. And we were talking about this kind of issue probably during the W administration. And, he was talking about Republicans at that time not having moral values. And I said, Harry, you will never be able to talk to those people as long as you start from a position that you have a moral value and they don't. You just cannot get anywhere. Dale Carnegie would tell you right off, you never get anywhere starting off a conversation with people telling them they're wrong. And I think to this day, I've been looking a lot more at moral foundation theory and going back over various ethical value systems. But I think that the MAGA people are righteously indignant. So it isn't just that they're angry, it's they're righteous about it because it offends some of their moral principles. And if we don't accept that they have moral principles that are different than ours, we can't get a foothold with them, I think, because it's got to start with their emotions and their idea of righteousness. If we're gonna communicate with them, I'm not sure how that translates into what we're going to do about it. Mind you, I'm not an activist at heart, so I'm not good at that. But I think that's where it has to start. We are not missionaries. We are not going to go save the MAGA Republicans.
And
It's
you're certainly right, because trying to start a discussion saying you're wrong, that's what the problem is going to get you nowhere.
And there's a difference, Paul, in what I'm saying between talking about an individual and talking about an attack on the rule of law.
Yes.
I think that in talking with people, we can agree on certain basic tenets. But when they say those tenets no longer exist, then there's a problem. And it may not be on an individual basis as much as it is on a structural or not MAGA, but overarching basis. And that's the problem. Things are being destroyed as we watch. Sometimes people aren't even aware of them being destroyed.
Sure. There was an interesting article, I think it was today, in the Atlantic about something called a prerogative system of justice as opposed to the normal system of justice, and how it happened in Hitler's Germany that the state required that everyday contracts were honored and all that kind of stuff. People were protected from, petty crime and all that. And so the normal justice system at that level had to continue. But there was a sort of parallel justice system where the people in power got away with egregious violations of justice, and it suggests that that's kind of what we're seeing, that Trump and his administration and his cronies are operating in a different legal structure than the everyday life of the country. So I think your point is well taken, by the way.
It's not only just Trump and his cronies, but the autocratic playbook across the world. If you look
yes,
at it, yeah,
and
that has to be too, where they try to focus on the differences rather than the similarities in order to retain power. And I think
yes,
power and money are the two things that are the motivating factors for those people. And it's not necessarily the people underneath who have bought into it. It's the ones on top who are controlling it.
Maybe we could open up to not just talking the Republicans versus Democrats in the US, but take it to, I don't know, like the as some of what you had us read, was about the indigenous peoples here in the United States, versus the Europeans that came over, or we might talk about, in a larger sense, slavery, which, the more I read and went back and back and back and finding out, how many hundreds of, or not hundreds, many, many thousands of years ago, that there were slaves. And the places where we go when we travel were made by slaves. And it was in the New Testament, or go to gay or not gay, or acceptance of this or that, and if we could be the ones on the side of the you're wrong, or as much as we think you're wrong, and how do we is it, or we could go to the cartels of Mexico or Venezuela or wherever, and them supplying a need for a demand and being businessmen, but because it's illegal, how horrible they're doing these things and treating other humans to achieve goals. Yes, we draw a line on, okay, that's totally unacceptable, but then we have to be open at some point and say, I'm just saying you're wrong and you have to see my side. Maybe I'm a little bit off in my way of looking at things and I need to see a new perspective. And we're going to ask them why, but we have to be answering those whys and being open-minded that we could look at things a little differently too. Have compassion, empathy. That why question that Bob mentioned is important.
Discussion, not debate. Try and find out what you have in common. You're both Americans, you're both law-abiding, you're both, as much as you can find that you have in common is the way to go forward.
And one thing we can all find in common is we all love our children and want the best for them.
Yep.
And certainly the way you have traveled around the world, Keaton, you've had a chance to see that big time.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
I'm not sure that what we have in common actually works. For instance, one of the, at least in some moral theories, one of the principles of morality is respect for authority. Now, people who are very religious, they respect the authority of the Bible. Humanists don't do that. So right off, we don't have that in common. We don't have the same respect for authority. And I think that respect for authority, I won't call it a gene, but that innate capacity in humans helps authoritarian regimes. I mean, even liberals in the US were, one of their complaints about Joe Biden was he wasn't a strong enough leader. I mean, we were looking for leadership, for authority. So I think that we have too narrow a notion of what people have in common. It isn't that, if we would reason together, we would all that what we have in common would answer the problem. But
I think to a certain extent, you can cross bridges with people who come in from different points of view, like you said, authority, but you have to have a certain amount of willingness to do that on both sides. And I was just thinking about a woman that I knew in Panama who completely different from me in every respect, politically, socially, everything. But we became friends because we worked in the same volunteer group. But on both sides, both of us tried very hard to find common ground in areas. And in that case, you can bridge the us versus them. If you have an us versus them situation and you are the only person trying to make a bridge, it becomes very unhealthy. I mean, it's almost like a using situation, somebody's using the other one. So I think there are people that we can make bridges with, but they have to be people who are also willing to make some movement toward us. even if we make the first move. But if you continue to be the only person who makes movement towards someone, that's not ever going to be a healthy relationship.
It's, when you're looking at people, regardless, the commonality of having empathy and compassion, I think, is the bridge. If they do not have empathy or compassion, then really they are a very cold fish and hard to deal with.
And curiosity.
And curiosity. Brad, I know you came in late. Do you have any comments on the subject? You're muted, Brad.
Oh, I'm not used to, hi, everyone. I'm not used to Zoom on handheld. I'm just so I think when we have tightly held opinions that to change them is almost to change your psyche. And this is beyond upsetting. When I engage conservatives in conversation, they almost always drop out because if they say, if I get them to agree to something and then they have to disagree with that a minute later, then I don't try to do that like an attorney does to someone when they're on the witness stand. But it's apparent that they've gotten a lot of what they say from listening to someone else rather than having thought it through and have it been their original opinion. It's difficult, and I think there, and I'd have to stand up for myself that I find my anger emotions are stronger than my whatever the opposite of that is. If I see something, well, yeah, I want to fix that, but if it's something that was really done wrong, then it makes me more want to be active against that, and I think that's what I see people charged with. Listening to those stations, they try to rile people up and get their anger side, and then it's like the same emotions you get at a football game. I just go out and get them, and his logic goes by the side. I'm sorry that got to be long-winded. I don't know the normalities for the group here.
That's fine. You're within the ballpark, Brad.
There's one other alternative that my wife has taken, and that is just disconnect. And it's pretty radical. If you knew my wife, she's probably the one of the least confrontational people I've met in my life, which is probably why she's sort of taken this position. But her whole family is deep MAGA, and she just has said, I just can't deal with it. I don't want to go even in my hometown, and I'm just going to disconnect. And, Bob, you're starfish. She talks about that all the time. I'd rather spend my time doing things that I believe are virtuous than arguing about it with anybody. They're not going to change. I'm not going to change. And so I'm just going to disconnect from that. And I'm going to go about my life and try to live my life as virtuously as I possibly can, and just not get involved in those conversations.
Okay, final thoughts, gang. We'll go around the room. Richard?
Again, I think both sides are natural to human beings, and we need to understand this and see what we can do to shape a society that balances tribal instincts with the benefits of cooperation and diversity.
Joyce?
That it's very difficult to make these kinds of societal changes in the position that we are in now. And what we can each individually do is to try to cultivate relationships with people who are different from us, but maybe there's something we can bridge, whether they have curiosity or empathy, like you mentioned, Susie. Some way we can bridge that difference, but I think it's very difficult.
Paul?
I guess I was thinking about purity. We have the disgust emotion in humans is very, very strong, partly because it's protected us against eating things which are harmful. But to some people, purity means no transgender, no homosexuality. To others, purity means no GMO, I don't know, no farm raised salmon. But the purity instinct and disgust is something we have in common, even though we express it differently. So maybe that's one place where I would talk about commonality, not just opinion or gut emotion.
Mike?
The only thing I would add is that Heather Cox Richardson calls Trump a fascist. It's not a Nazi fascism, that's a different deal. But that to me is a pretty bright line.
Deborah? You're muted, Deborah.
It might be naive, but I'm hopeful that with some of the energy that's being created, the pendulum will swing back.
Keaton?
Well, I share that opinion. I think that pendulum will go back. And again, I just reiterate that when you meet someone, you want to have a discussion and find out what you have in common, not to debate and tell them their thinking is wrong. Finally, as we're ending, I'd like to just briefly mention this Signal chat with the editor-in-chief of the Atlantic in the chat. This is insane. Our government is just completely falling apart. That's my last thought. Thank you.
Susie?
But going along with that, because the communications are so enormous right now, that's not the right word. You know, well, it's good and it's bad because we can only look at, well, what is it called? Have your echo chamber, or we can try to get as much as possible and try and find truth and justice and what's right for the most of the people on the planet, and change what isn't right. And I feel like things are moving in a better direction. A lot of shit to get there, but you know, distinguishing between right and wrong and best for all, I think we will get there. But people have to see a lot more and think about it, and then like, whoa, can't keep on that way.
Brad, any final thought from you?
Yeah, Bob, I'm sorry. What was the title of the group today?
Well, the title, the thesis was, are we hardwired, evolutionarily hardwired to separate us versus them? And
That's right. I think that what I've found is that it's difficult for people to change their opinions once they have them, and this is even true. I've seen for studies for statisticians that should know better when they're offered questions that end up tripping them up. So I've got one in-law that's sort of independent and is very conservative, but independent in his thinking. And every time I talk to him, I do learn something. Normally it's about myself, things I can't, I'm no longer at work trying to find the truth because that's what I had to do. But I need to think about the situation I'm in. So it's a slow process.
How about you, Bob?
for me, I think that we are hardwired, and we have to work hard in overcoming the evolutionary and biological aspect of our identities to reach out for inclusion. But it can be done. We can overcome it. We can't break the social identity theory and be inclusive. But yes, there is a biological aspect to this. Yeah, Devorah.
I just have one question, totally off topic, but I have to ask Paul something. Paul, I'm hearing New England in your voice. Am I right?
Yes, I grew up in Maine, although I currently live in Florida.
Okay, I grew up in New Hampshire, lived in Maine for a while, lived in Rhode Island for a while, and most recently New Hampshire. I heard dropping those ahs.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
So next month, in honor of Earth Day, we're going to explore the Gaia hypothesis. Don't know what that is, wait for the reads. It'll be interesting. Thank you all for participating. As usual, I've enjoyed it. And it's been a delightful hour.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Bye.